This week on Operant Innovations, we introduce our new series, ABA Technologies Thought Leaders. Throughout this series, we will be hearing from the amazing minds behind ABA Technologies, how they got into the field, what is ABA Tech, and where are we going. On this episode, we get to sit down with Dr. Jose Martinez Diaz to hear all about his journey into the field.
Alrighty.
Well, happy news.
All right,
Okay.
so we're going to go ahead and get started with our Operant Innovations podcast today. So, of course, this is brought to us by ABA Technologies, and we have the pleasure as the professional development team with Dr. Allison King, Shauna Costello, and Kelly Therian to be interviewing the founder of ABA Technologies, Dr. Jose Martinez Diaz. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for doing this and having me. I hope that I can do well.
Absolutely. I'm sure you will. We've got just a couple of questions for you. We just know that, so many people want to hear more about you and about your history and how you came to be who you are and the icon that you are in the field. So if we could just start, can you tell us some about your history, sort of how you came into the field of behavior analysis, some of your educational background, and just sort of that path?
Yeah, well, I can talk over an hour just on that, but some people have heard my story of El Loco and how when I was about 7 years old in Cuba, that my mother told me that the reason I couldn't go outside the gates of our house out into the street was because there was a loco in the neighborhood. The loco next door, I called him, was actually about a block away because we lived in several acres. But she was worried that he would escape and then that he would hurt me. And because he had hurt my uncle, her brother, when my uncle was a teenager. And I asked about this loco, and they said that he had been my uncle's friend. They had gone to school together and all, but one day he got violent and tried to strangle my uncle, and that after that the parents locked him up in the attic, and that she hoped that that's where he still was, so he couldn't hurt anybody else, which totally hurt me. And for my mother to be saying that also hurt me, because my mother, I wouldn't think, would have wished anything like that on anybody. But I felt like I have several acres to run around in where I live, but I want to go out on the street, and I can't go out on the street. But this man has been locked up in the attic and not able to go anywhere for decades, because this was when he was a teenager, and I knew my uncle was in his 40s. So, my goodness, I just felt very bad for the man. So I asked my mother, isn't there any way to help him? And he said, there's Mazorra, and Mazorra was the local lunatic asylum. And you can imagine One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and some of those movies and books about asylums. I've watched many of them, and a lot of them are like true. That's the way things were, and perhaps in places they still are, unfortunately. And of course they didn't help him there. And I said, are there any people who can help people like this who are crazy? And she said, well, there's psychiatrists. That's all she knew, psychiatrist. And nothing about psychologists, but she said psychiatrist. And I said, well, are there any psychiatrists here in Cienfuegos? And she said that there had been one, and he wasn't able to help him at all. And and I said, oh, I want to meet him. I want to talk to him, see how he helps people that are crazy. And she said, well, he's actually Saturnino's dad. Saturnino was one of my classmates at the time, and I said, oh yes, so I'd like to meet him. Maybe I can go visit Saturnino. And she said, no, he's not alive anymore. And I said, oh, he died, and this is what happened? He must not be that old. And he said he killed himself. And that's how I found out about suicide, and that people actually killed themselves. And I felt really bad about that too. And then I found here's somebody who helps crazy people, and here's somebody who actually knows how to help people, and he does something crazy, because I thought killing yourself sounded like the craziest thing there was. And I said, and I went up to my room, and right next to my room was the library for the house, and I started looking up, and we had an Encyclopedia Britannica translated into Spanish, and I looked up psychiatry, I looked up then psychology, and I read all this stuff that didn't make any sense, and it really didn't make any sense to me whatsoever that any of this could help people. But I didn't give up, so I started, but I sort of put it on the back burner until I got to high school, and then as soon as I got to high school, I took a psychology class, even though it wasn't part of my program. I took it as an extra class that I didn't have to take over the summer, and I read about Freud, and that didn't make any sense to me either, and I says, wow, I don't know if there's any way to help these people, but I was fortunate enough that I didn't give it up, because I went to the University of Miami and majored in psychology, and I figured maybe it's not psychiatrists who can help people, maybe it's psychologists, and I started learning, and I was fortunate enough that my first advisor was behavioral, Fred Newman, and I was in the honors program, so I got to spend a lot of time with my advisor, and he's my first exposure to behavior analysis was from him, and also I learned about the work of Fred Keller before I even learned about the work of B.F. Skinner, because Fred Newman used Fred Keller's approach to teaching, and he had the class I took from him in the summer after my freshman year was set up as a PSI class, a personalized system of instruction, and he said this is a behavioral way of teaching, and I took that class, and I finished it in like 3 weeks, and I got an A. And then I had the rest of the summer in which I didn't have to take the class, and I thought, this is wonderful. I finished my whole class I was supposed to take all summer in 3 weeks, and I didn't get bored, and I felt really good about myself having learned this stuff fast and well. And then he said, hey, you should be a tutor for the other students, and I can pay you as a tutor. You did so well. And then he actually had me be a tutor in the fall and the spring of the following year, and he taught me a lot about the PSI method and how to teach from a behavioral perspective. And in fact, even though that was not clinical psychology, which is what I thought I was interested in, helping crazy people, my first exposure was to a behavioral approach to education, which is what eventually I wound up doing after I transitioned from clinical psychology to education instead, which is I don't know. I can go a couple of ways here now, because I can talk about then how I made that transition, or I can talk about then how I still pursued my dream of helping crazy people, because essentially I did both.
Mm-hmm.
But different experiences led me to different things. So I guess I'll go historically in terms of the order of events.
Timelines, yeah.
Mhm.
That'd be helpful, I think.
The timeline. And in terms of the timeline I was still interested in helping crazy people. I was interested in teaching people, but I was also interested in helping crazy people. And I say crazy in because that's what the term that was used back in those days. A term like the it's like, over the years and decades, certain words become bad words, like curse words, like mentally retarded used to be an acceptable term, and then this developmentally disabled was a term, and then that was a bad term too, and oh my goodness, the language just changes, and you can't say certain things anymore that you used to say. But the I wanted to help people that heard voices, and people that said things that didn't make any sense, and so forth. They were very interesting to me, but I also wanted to help them. So I started working at local mental hospitals. First, I worked at Jackson Memorial Hospital while an undergraduate as a psychiatric attendant, and I saw awful things happening there. What I saw was people being put in straitjackets, people being held down on the ground, face down, with people holding them down, and then a nurse coming over with a big needle and then giving them a shot, and even chloral hydrate. It smelled awful, and it sunk them out, and they were taken and given electric shock treatments, and they came out like zombies. And when I remember trying to talk to them afterwards, and even the day after, they didn't remember things that we had talked about the day before. And it was like they didn't remember me anymore. And I thought, this can't be good. This can't be good. And and the head nurse there told me I shouldn't be talking to them anyway, that my job was to empty bedpans and take care of their physical needs, that there were people there to help them. And I made the mistake of telling her, you really are helping them? Looks like you're hurting them. I got fired. Anyway, that was my first experience in working in a psychiatric hospital. I got fired, and I'm glad I got fired, because I couldn't have stood another day in that place. So then I went to work at Varieties Children's Hospital, but there was a unit there. The psychiatric unit was run by people that did not own Varieties. It was a company that rented a whole floor of that hospital. Montanari Clinical Schools, they were called, because they started out as schools, and then they expanded into having other kinds of programs, residential programs, and psychiatry. Later on, they were exposed in 60 Minutes, and I was glad, because that was another crazy place. The people who were in those places were less crazy than the people who ran those places, is what I found. But by the way, by this time I had found out that behavior analysis could not only help in teaching, but could help people with what I call clinical problems. I call them clinical because it's clinicians who work with them, right? And it's clinical psychology specializes in helping people that are given diagnosis by either the psychologist or by psychiatrist from some other clinician, right? That can give a diagnosis. But I learned in my sophomore year, I took a class in learning and the principles of learning from a behavioral guy who was later on I found out that what he had learned was the experimental analysis of behavior. So we read Reynolds' principles, a primer of operant conditioning, and we read Skinner's Science and Human Behavior, and we read a bunch of articles, and then we had a rat lab, and I took a second class learning too from him also, and then we even learned more stuff, and then we even learned about behavior modification. One of the books was a behavior a behavior math textbook from the time.
Was this all at the University of Miami?
That was all at the University of Miami.
Wow.
We had behavioral faculty there at the time. In fact, my good friend Joe Wyatt, that wound up going into his PhD program at West Virginia, was getting his master's there in experimental analysis of behavior. Of course, it was called experimental psychology, but it was behavioral, so it was the experimental analysis of behavior. And we had the operant laboratories with the Skinner chambers, the operant chambers there, and all that. So we learned all that at the University of Miami. I came out trained in the experimental analysis of behavior, and not as a graduate student level, but as an undergraduate. No, I don't think it's that way anymore there, because a lot of schools went cognitive, and the psychology department went cognitive starting in the mid-70s, but later on. I went to school in college in the 60s and early 70s before the cognitive revolution took over.
Well, it's amazing how much you were able to do even in an undergraduate program, to have exposure to so many different things, and to just the breadth of it sounds like was really impressive.
Oh, well, yeah, well, there were several factors. Not only is the University of Miami really good, it's still really good. The faculty were top notch. But the other thing is, I was fortunate enough to qualify for not only the honors program, but something called privileged studies. It's where you came in and they waived all your prerequisites because of your test scores, and you can work closely with your faculty advisor to design your own curriculum to suit what you wanted to do, without having to take all the stuff like, oh, you have to take so many social sciences, so much history, so much this, so much that. I knew all that stuff already coming into college. I read voraciously all through my life from the time I was a little kid. I just read and read. So when they tested me, it seemed like I knew about all the basic subjects. I knew science. I knew liberal arts. I knew all that stuff already. So and then I spent a lot of time with my advisor, first Fred Newman, and then the second man was called Bob Jones. His real name was Marshall Robert Jones, but he went by Bob, and he said, I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool behaviorist, but I'm an empiricist, and the behavioral approach has the most empirical support. That's what he told me. and he said, maybe one of these days we'll discover there's something better. But now that's what the research shows. And then he showed me how there were clinical applications. So for example, when I was working at Varieties at Montanari clinical schools, I had a boy with autism there that he was there, and he was engaging in self-injury. That's the first time I saw self-injury, and how they restrained him and gave him in 5-point restraints to a bed most of his time, and they also gave him lots of shots and put him in straitjackets and so forth. And I thought it was cruel and inhumane, but they said that there was nothing else they could do for him but keep him safe. And then when I talked to Bob Jones about that, he gave me articles by Ivar Lovas to read, and by Todd Risley from the early days, because Todd Risley had done work on that as well, and some of the other folks, and I read this stuff, and we can help them. So again, I go off to the clinical director there, who was kind of in charge of treatment, and I talked to him. He was a licensed clinical social worker, and I told him all about this. So here's how we can help this kid. This is what I've learned, and brought him some articles, and he said, well, I'm the clinical director, but I'm not in charge of treatment. The psychiatrist is. She signs off on all the treatment plans here. This is a medical facility. This is a hospital, not not an outpatient clinic. You have to talk to the psychiatrist. And I set up an appointment to talk to her, and I talked to her, and she says, maybe you don't need to work here. And I get fired again. So anyway, I wanted to help people. These people weren't helping people. I was getting exposed to all this bad stuff. I was learning all the good stuff at the University of Miami. I was trying to bring it back and tell the people in the places that I was working about it, and I was getting fired for it. So I already knew that I had to that I was going to go get my PhD. Ever since I started at the University of Miami, everybody told me, all the faculty, all my advisors told me, you need to get your PhD. You need to get your PhD. That you can't stop. Anyway, so I was PhD bound, but the experiences of getting fired, I said, I can't be working as an underling. I have to be in charge of treatment. I have to get my PhD.
And good for you not to get discouraged by the firings and think to try to find a different path, that you were coming up against this resistance and not being able to make a difference. To keep trying.
Not only that. The last time I got fired, I started ABA Technology because I kept getting fired for decades after that. I'll have to tell you some of those stories some other time because really, I have never, ever, ever not fought for what's right and for the client's best interest, and that is not always what the people who are in charge are all about. They're about something else, and the contingencies in place operating on their behavior are counterproductive in terms of let's do what's good for the people we are helping. And there's financial contingencies, and there are other types of contingencies. I won't get into them now. That's for another time. But what happens is somebody like myself comes in and starts rocking the boat and saying, you're not doing this right. We need to do this for people, and we need to do this right. And then so if you're not the boss, they get rid of you. And hey, but I've always been able to find something else to do. I've never been unemployed for long, and I've always had 2 jobs anyway. I've never had just one job, I don't think. Even when I was a paper boy, I had another job back when I was 13 years old. So anyway, so the thing is that at the University of Miami is where I learned about behavior analysis, where I got exposed to Fred Keller first, then B.F. Skinner, and operant conditioning, as it was called back then. Now it's called operant selection, for those of you who are still calling operant conditioning. But anyway, the thing is that then I got advised to go to West Virginia University for my PhD by Bob Jones, and that was the best advice I'd ever gotten. And this is why he gave me that advice. He said, look, there's only a few schools in the country where you can learn applied behavior analysis, behavior mod, to really help people, and that's what you want to do. There's a lot of really, really good programs in the experimental analysis of behavior, but you want to be a professional, you want to be a clinician, you don't want to be in the laboratory working with rats and pigeons, do you? Because he knew me, I wanted to help people. So you would have a much bigger choice if you just wanted to study, go into an experimental psychology program and learned more about working, doing experiments with rats and pigeons. Plenty of those. But for behavior mod, you need to go to one of these programs. Now the programs are Western Michigan, who already had a great reputation, but it says they only have a master's program. At the time, they only did. Later on, they had their PhD program. And you can't do much with a master's. That was, of course, before board certification and licensing for behavior analyst. It was true. You could practice as a licensed psychologist, and there were not clinical social work programs that were behavioral. There were no mental health counseling programs that were behavioral. It was all clinical stuff, clinical psych stuff, psychology programs. But anyway, and that you can go to Kansas, but that's a program that's really human development, and you can get your PhD there and come out with a lot of good stuff, but you won't be able to be a licensed psychologist, and then you'll have to work at a state institution all your life or work for the government or something. But I know you don't want to work for people. You want to work for yourself, and you also want to make some money, because I know you. And we shared. I'd been to his house. He had a nice house. He had a nice practice on the side. He was not a poor man. And he said, you know how I live. You want to live like me, right? He said, yeah. Well, you need to get licensed to do that. Says, yeah, well, I like helping people, but I also like making money. But anyway, and then he went over all the different programs. SIU, well, that's a rehab program. Again, you can't be licensed, and so forth. The only place where you can get your PhD in clinical psychology and get licensed and still learn behavior analysis, behavior mod, is West Virginia University. And at the time, that was true. So off I went. Country roads, take me home to the place I belong. West Virginia. No mountain mama though. Alrighty. So off I went to West Virginia, and I never regretted it. I had such a wonderful time there. I stayed 5 years. Before then, I went off to do my internship. I did do my dissertation work after I left, because I spent so much time doing other things in grad school and learning so much that I never had time to do my dissertation in the 5 years I was there. So I did my dissertation when I left on my internship was at the clinical research unit for the study of schizophrenia at Camarillo State Hospital, but it was by UCLA staff with UCLA research professors, and the psychiatrist was a UCLA research professor. He only came 1 day a week, but he was at UCLA the rest of the time over in the main campus. The psychologists were UCLA faculty and had their PhDs from UCLA, and so forth, and had trained with Lobas, some of them, and so forth. And that's where I did my internship, and then I wound up doing my dissertation at the clinical research unit also. But at the time that I was there, I also did a rotation at it was called the Autistic Children's Research Unit. And that was also started by UCLA people, by Ivar Lobas and some other folks from UCLA. And so I was at a state institution, but I was more like a university research centers there that I was working, and that's where I stayed working at both places because I wanted to still work with los locos, the people with schizophrenia, diagnosis of schizophrenia. I enjoyed that so much, but I also worked in the autism children's unit, and I stayed there for 10 years, working and learning more, and feeling like I was really, really helping people. And at last, I was happy, and nobody tried to fire me while I was there. And I wasn't the boss, but my boss in both places. In the autism unit, the director of the autism program there was Izzy Perel, who had trained as a behavior analyst. He had his PhD also, and he loved that I was a formally trained behavior analyst, because most of the psychologists they hired And that's what they hired at the time, psychologists, not behavior analysts, because there was no such thing as a separate thing that you could jobs for behavior analysts. That didn't exist back in those days. We're talking about the late 70s and early 80s here. Again, they hired us a psychologist, licensed psychologist, okay, and then my boss was also a psychologist, but behavioral, and he was also into doing the best to help people, and we got along and worked together for a long time. And then in the clinical research unit, it was Steve Wong, who had trained at Western Michigan, and he was not license eligible. By then they had a PhD program. He had to retread in some clinical stuff to become licensed, but for being a UCLA research professor, he didn't have to be licensed. But anyway, so in fact, I don't think he ever got licensed in California, because as a research professor, he didn't have to be, and what he was doing was research, not clinical practice. The psychiatrist was signing up on the clinical practice stuff. But anyway, it was interesting times, but I learned a lot. And I've always said that between the University of Miami, West Virginia University, and then the UCLA Camarillo experience for 10 years, so it was a total of 19 years of getting ready to make a difference. And I was making a difference, but I felt like it was time to do more. And then I left. When I was, by then I was 37 years old, and I can tell you that part of the story some other time.
Thank you for joining us on Operant Innovations. Stay tuned for more from Dr. Jose Martinez Diaz, Tom Freeman, Darnell Lital, and more. If you have feedback or suggestions, please contact us at operatinnovations@abatechnologies.com.